So to open things up, I'd like to direct my first question to Paul. How can the findings of your report help inform future decision-making with respect to public infrastructure investment, and more importantly, avoid negative unintended consequences?
Okay, thank you. Great question. Essentially, with an evaluation approach such as this, it allows you to look at the trade-offs and to look at the consequences of going in one particular direction or another on your infrastructure policy. The other aspect of an evaluation platform like this is it starts to measure the consequences of not actually sticking to the plan as well. So in the past, infrastructure has been allowed to be a political process because very rarely do we actually see someone measuring the consequences of, say, a political process turning on its heel and going into a different direction. So we hope that this is the beginning of new technology that will actually help guide the powers to be, that will actually help guide the planners to be able to justify exactly why they're proposing to put certain things together. And by the end of the day, it's all about sustainability.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn things over to the mayor now. Let me follow on that question. The board itself, we've long advocated for evidence-based decision-making, particularly when it comes to transit. Do you feel this type of economic modeling will provide the evidence required to help take the politics out of decision-making?
Then I'm out of a job. You will never take the politics out of decision-making, but you can expect better decision-making, and only if you can communicate the results of this work very, very clearly, and that is a challenge indeed. I'm going to answer with the movie quote. Some of you will know the movie Ghostbusters. Bill Murray, the late Harold Ramis, Dan Aykroyd are standing in the mayor of New York's office trying to convince him to do something about this crisis of paranormal proportions that's enveloping the city. And they're saying things like fire and brimstone, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria, and the mayor is unmoved. He's not going to do anything about it. Then Bill Murray says to him, listen, Lenny, if we're wrong, we'll all go to jail quietly, but if we're right, you will have saved the lives of millions of registered voters. And at that point, the mayor says, what do you need? I tell that story because fundamentally that's an irrational kind of way to make a decision, isn't it? But I've been trying to tackle the issue all through my political career. I'm an economist by background, which is really dangerous once you get into politics. People are not the rational actors that we expect them to be. And I think that's partly because we measure utility in the wrong way. Why is it that $5 on somebody's power bill matters far more to them than $50 on their cell phone bill? Why will they make the trade-offs that they make even when the pricing signals are clearly signaling a different decision than the decisions that they make? If we could figure out how to properly measure utility, I would benefit as a politician. And also I think this agenda and the work that's been done by CanSIA, which is tremendous work and tremendously important, then it can gain traction because I believe it has the ability to better measure through agent-based modeling people's decisions and agents' decisions, and more correctly measures utility with its systemic approach. So the key to me, to answer your question, is can we take the politics out? No, but if we wish for outcome-based decision-making, we must find a way to take, and this is a Herculean task, the complexity of what we're discussing today and being able to explain it to somebody while you're standing in line for a coffee, because that's the currency of decision makers. And that is a tremendous challenge, and we can be very upset about the fact that the world is like that. We can berate Twitter for 140 characters, for reducing politics to 140 characters. But we must instead see it as an opportunity, because it is a reality. We must capture people's attention with a very short and direct way of doing this. And it can't be the Ghostbusters description of the apocalypse. It's got to be a description of the benefit. And if we can do that, if we can engage people in that way, we can, and the recent federal election shows it, we can appeal to their optimism and appeal to their desire for outcome-based decisions. And that will take some of the politics out of it.
Perfect, thank you. Last question before I open it up to the floor. John, why is this research so important now?
Well, there's a lot of, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or an economist to figure out that there's a lot of congestion problems, particularly in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. I often drive out to construction sites around the province, and the biggest part of the problem is getting out of Toronto. It's once you're out of Toronto, you're usually okay. I'm lucky, I live in kind of midtown Toronto, but thousands and thousands of people experience what I do times 10 every day, especially if they're coming from outside into Toronto. It's not, it's not complicated. If you're sitting in traffic for hours and hours and hours every day and you can't get to your work and you're not productive, then it's a no-brainer, I think, for a lot of people. And it's no more complicated than that.
Okay, questions from the floor?
Carl Bodymead, Ontario Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. When we talk about public infrastructure investment, the normal association is a new transit line, new highways, perhaps HOT lanes, etc. But my question to the panel, and I see two of the panel are involved in building new infrastructure. New infrastructure often is a great ribbon cutting opportunity for the mayor and other politicians, but I'd like the panel really to comment on the need to maintain the existing infrastructure we have now and ensuring that adequate funds and investment are put into that now. And I'd like Paul as well to comment on how his model can associate that. So it's really a question of, rather than new infrastructure, how can we make sure that the infrastructure we have right now is adequately maintained so it performs and provides a service?
Okay, John, you were putting up your hand for that, and then Mark.
Yeah, let me take a crack at that. At Infrastructure Ontario, we obviously do a lot of design, build, finance, maintain projects where you build the maintenance into the price of the contract and the life cycle replacement, and that allows the bidder to think about over 30 years, what is the whole life of the project, what are the trade-offs between the construction and the life cycle and how well you maintain it. Should you invest more up front? An obvious example would be on highways. Should you put in concrete as the base or should you use asphalt? And obviously concrete lasts longer. And I'm just looking at David at the back who's going, yeah, because he's with the Concrete Association back there. But that's the trade-offs you can now make if you're not just going for lowest price. And you can look at the price, the net present value over 30 years, and I think that does result in better decision making on infrastructure.
Okay, sure.
Well, I just note, municipalities historically did a relatively poor job of asset management, not just in terms of the actual works, but in terms of understanding what the priorities need to be and the scale of the issue. That's changed dramatically in the last 5 years because virtually all municipalities have some form of asset management plan now, and the larger ones have very complex and sophisticated ones, or at least we like to think so. The trick is then translating that into political spending decisions. And the key there often is to express to some extent how much more it's going to cost people if we don't do it properly in the first place. We recently instituted a 1% infrastructure levy on our property tax. It's like the last thing any local politician wants to vote for. But part of our case for that, and I believe we made it successfully enough that there's some degree of public acceptance, is that in the older areas of our community, the infrastructure deficit is experienced every day. But we've also been careful to make the case that we are preventing putting costs onto our kids that are going to be much greater.
And Mark,
I'd like to make one additional point, and it picks up on John's. I mean, as you know, John was referring to the alternative financing and procurement approach, or P3 approach, that is a major component of the Government of Ontario's approach to infrastructure development. And yes, it does ensure that you address the issue of long-term maintenance, and in some cases operations. But the other value of this approach is that, and you've got lots of examples in Ontario that went a different way. Think of the Spadina extension, Union Station, and others, where they went way over budget and well behind schedule. In the case of the AFP model, as it's best exemplified in Ontario, I think the numbers are that 98% of those projects are brought in on budget, 75% on time. And I think on those two considerations alone, the merits of the approach, when it's done for the right reasons, has really, really brought home results for Ontario and other jurisdictions around Canada.
Okay. Actually, if I could just follow through on that, Mark, for you. You know, we hear a lot of criticism at times about our pension funds investing offshore rather than here when we've got such a high demand for infrastructure. And they are saying that they feel at times that our projects are too high risk and too low return. So what, in your opinion, can we be doing to create better conditions for pension plans so that the mayor is not having to ask for another infrastructure levy on the taxpayers in his community?
Well, I won't speak for the pension funds themselves, although I would say that in general, the pension funds are actually looking for risk. And the reality is that they found it difficult to invest in projects in Ontario and in Canada at large because they aren't able to write big enough equity checks. So their concern has been around the need to generate the revenues that they need in order to be able to meet their pension obligations. So I think at some point there's a little bit of a rethink necessary here. And what's interesting is on the one hand, governments are all challenged by serious financial realities, but at the same time, they tend to be investing too much of their own money in the projects, which then doesn't leave enough room. You probably don't agree with that, do you, John?
No, I don't agree with that.
Well, then you'll get a moment to just think through your answer for a moment.
Yeah. I already know it, so yeah.
That's
so
the problem, is you're going to go emotional straight away. However,
Okay, panelists, no fighting, please, no fighting.
it's a good issue. The reality is that for the pension funds who are looking at opportunities, they're looking, first of all, for acquisitions, which is why a Hydro One is attractive to them. And secondly, they're looking for the ability to write bigger equity checks, and so they tend to look further afield because those opportunities exist there.
Yeah, I think
Now,
yeah, okay, Mark, you've said your piece. Okay, so Mark is right to the extent that they're not, I don't think that the risk is too high. Maybe the returns are too low, but remember, my job here is also to protect taxpayers. It's not just to help out pension funds generate good investments for their beneficiaries. That's not my job. And so, yeah, Mark is right that they want to invest like a $500 million equity ticket at a time. They're going to do as much research and investigations for 500 as they are for 50 million. So they'd rather have the big projects. The only one we've got approaching kind of big enough for them would have been Eglinton Crosstown LRT. And, we're not really having a problem attracting equity investors. And really, it's the government's decision as to whether they want to build a $10 billion project or a $5 billion project. The reality is we're not as big in Ontario as, buying a port or an airport or something going on in London, England, or in New York or wherever it is. And so if they have to go offshore, that's just the way it is. But, maybe one day we'll get up to a $10 billion project and maybe there will be a $500 million equity ticket and they can bid for that. But, we're not quite there yet.
Well, let me just follow through. Oh, Mark, you want to rebut?
Just one little addendum. No, it's not a rebuttal. I support everything John is saying. What's important here is that there is also a secondary market in Canada in which the pension funds are engaging. So the 407 is a good case in point, where Macquarie was the initial investor because they're an infrastructure fund that really their portfolio is built on risk. And once the predictability of that project settled down, became more predictable, Macquarie sold their holdings to the Canada Pension Plan and Investment Board. So all of a sudden, CPPIB is now a major player in the 407, but for a different reason.
And can I just say, there is not an absence of pension funds. There are smaller pension funds playing through various sources. And one example would be the Laborers International Union pension fund is invested in a pile of projects all across the province, particularly hospitals, courthouses, through Fengate. And, LIUNA, as we call them for short, those are the laborers who actually are working on the project, their pension funds are also invested. I think they feel pretty good about that. Maybe people don't care, but somebody was talking earlier, it's not just about solid returns, it's about also feeling an alignment of interest as you go into those things. Also, I know the college teachers have invested, I believe, through Plenary Group. So they're investing in it as well, and I'm sure there are more examples out there where people are putting their money back into Ontario infrastructure.
And let me follow that through with the mayor here. I mean, the partial monetization of assets like Hydro One, some controversy about that, but there is an argument that money can be more strategically leveraged for economic development opportunities. So, Mayor, do you think we are ready and should be looking at new revenue tools or a shift in spending priorities to find the necessary dollars for public infrastructure? Or should we continue to look on, the province, the municipalities, to find the fiscal resources to meet these investment requirements?
Yes, there's need for new revenue. So I said earlier, we chose to go to our residents for 1% dedicated for infrastructure, but our capacity, I mean, that's frankly still only fiddling at the edges. I'm actually one of those municipal politicians who supports the privatization of Hydro One. And that doesn't make me all that popular in my sector sometimes. The first point I would make, let's step back for a second. Did anybody think Hydro One didn't need change? And I think, when you read the reports, the asset rationalization argument, I believe holds water. And what we saw over the last 2 hours should doubly, triply, quadruply reinforce that argument, that if you can deploy capital for more beneficial purposes, then you should do so. Is it easy to do? No. And I think the Hydro One privatization is obviously being caught up in the whirlwind of an immensely unpopular file to begin with. But people are conflating the privatization with the cost of energy, which is, of course, just not correct. And I think that is more of a communications problem and challenge for the government than the action. I actually support the action. Now, in terms of revenue tools for capital, if we truly believed in using pricing symbols or signals and incentives to drive more efficient behavior in the economy, then we are going to need user pricing for roads. We are going to need carbon pricing for emissions. These are realities. They are very, very difficult political realities. And I don't even have the guts to go all that far all at once. I mean, if I tried road pricing in the city of Barrie, I wouldn't be mayor for long. Maybe Ken Sia is looking for economists. But I can tell you that the notion that we are asking people for a few dollars more a month directly invested in the infrastructure in our community, I believe has broad support. And that's very surprising to me, because I think there's an automatic assumption at the political level that any new tax, call it a fee, call it a revenue tool, call it whatever you wish, will be received extremely negatively. And that has actually not been my experience. I believe it's possible, but very, very difficult.
Okay, questions?
Yeah, hi there. My name is Maddie Simiatiki. I teach here at U of T. And my question is really about the difference between financing and funding. There seems to be a lot of confusion about these concepts in infrastructure. There's a big difference between projects that can fund themselves through user fees or through other types of charges and types of infrastructure that can't. The private sector's role in the projects that can't, like transit or perhaps social housing, is really to finance them, to provide the private sector can provide upfront money, but not necessarily return their investment through user fees. So I'm wondering how the panel views this dichotomy then, and what role really the public sector has to play. I think picking up on the mayor's comment about the role of new revenue tools to really pay for some of this infrastructure. Even if it's privately financed, it still has to be funded somehow.
John?
Yeah, if I can just answer that or wade in on that, Maddie. Maddie's done some work for us at Infrastructure Ontario on some interesting work on data collection and looking at innovation and things. But, it's funny. I find when I'm talking to unions, people more on the left, that they're saying, aha, you were doing this because it was off balance sheet. And, we've never pretended at Infrastructure Ontario that we do it for off-balance sheet reasons. Just because you get money from the private sector doesn't mean it's free. And in fact, most of our projects are done on what they call the availability-based model, which is there's actually the private financing goes into it to make it happen, but then you got to pay it back as soon as it's finished. And so really the financing is more of a project management mechanism to motivate the private sector to finish the project on time. And to create good due diligence. It's not about getting it off balance sheet or anything like that. There are other models out there, like, where you actually have a revenue source. Obviously, hospitals don't really have revenue sources which you can finance, or a courthouse, but a toll road could be like that. We have not done that at Infrastructure Ontario because, the government has decided not. We take our policy direction, obviously, from the government. An example of that would be Highway 407 East Phase 1, which is approaching completion now. That is an availability-based model, and the government has also made the decision that they're going to toll that road, but the tolling is separate from how the financing in the P3 model is taking place. And I don't know exactly why they did that, but I assume it has something to do with the experience that happened on 407 ETR. And that would have been the policy decision that they made. So you have to think about, you're absolutely right that the two are different. You have to be aware of that. And, I can say that at this point, Ontario has not been in a big way into, totally offloading the financing risk onto the private sector in terms of the private sector being the repayment vehicle for the financing.
Just another take on that. I'm going to turn that over to Paul. I guess the question is, should investments in transit and civil infrastructure be viewed differently or as complementary? Do they both make the same contribution to productivity and economic growth?
Infrastructure is like pretty much everything else that we experience in life. The systems are not the sum of their parts. The whole idea of infrastructure and economic activity and things of that nature demonstrates that value can be created by putting two things together. And so the answer, I think, is fairly clear, that there is a complementary there. It's to be understood. It's not going to be the same. There's no cookie cutter model to be able to do it for every particular connection. But it's the nuances and the connections and the dependencies need to be well understood. Because, in terms of the civil side of it, it goes a long way to the idea of creating a place. And so they can both feed off each other in terms of their productivity.
Okay. Other questions from the floor?
Can I just add on to
what
Paul said? We see that in design build projects at Infrastructure Ontario where the system is not the sum of its parts. And the one thing I want to talk about is design innovation. So what we have found is when you complete the design in advance and give it out to 3 or 5 bidders, you get prices coming in very close to each other because they're all bidding on the same design. When you do a design build model, and you just produce performance specifications or output specifications and you tell them to all come back with a solution, you can see 3 radically different designs with 3 radically different prices. And so far what we've seen, I think it's something like 60% of the projects with the highest scoring design tend to also have the lowest price, which surprised us when we looked at it internally. And just to give you one example, I know in our portion of the Union Pearson Express, we had 3 different bids, 3 different designs. The highest price was $180 million, the medium price was $160, and the lowest price was $130. And we're going, wow, that's really great. How could we? And it turned out that, of course, the lowest price was also the best design. It was designed and built by Aecon and Dufferin Construction, and that's an example we're really pleased with. It also happens on the building side. It doesn't happen always like that. I know our Deputy Minister, Giles Gerson, when he was speaking in front of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, I think back in the spring, he talked about the example of the hospital in Hamilton on West 5th Avenue up on the mountain, St. Joseph's Hospital, and he used that as an example where the winning bidder was, I think, 27 or 30% lower in price than the next 2 bidders. And that's a significant difference in price and a significant saving for taxpayers when you're building these things. And that's something that you can't count on under a traditional project model.
Well, just following through on that, I mean, the design element, critically important, but also earlier we spoke about severe weather events. How much of that is coming to play and how much of a priority are we making when we're considering bids for projects?
Well, it's certainly important to us. I mean, I'll just give a couple of examples. One is, obviously, by building the maintenance into the projects, we're thinking about making sure that the infrastructure is maintained properly and can deal with that. But I'll just give you a second example closer to home. The Athletes Village, we built a huge landform protection berm next to the Don River, so that, I mean, we couldn't develop the area until we made sure that the Don wasn't going to flood. And we know it floods from time to time, and was going to ruin those lands. So that's one thing. We also have what I call, I don't know if this is the right technical term, but a giant backflow preventer in the ground there to make sure that the Don doesn't flow up and get into back up the sewage in the Athletes Village. And so, we're thinking about these things all the time, and it's great that we were able to recover that land and use it, and it's been massively popular. It's won tons of awards. The architects who designed it, Dundee Kilmer, the developer, it's just, I haven't heard anybody say anything nasty about it, except there was one article on the flooring or something during just before the games, but that was a minor issue. But it's just been, for us, it's been a hugely successful project, and it came in on time and on budget. So
Perfect. Thank you.
Great panel. Richard Lyle, one of the hats I wear is as a director of the RCCO, and I can remember back when we were, I forget what it was, somebody said, well, the government's just announced this new investment in infrastructure, billions or millions or whatever, and we asked the question, well, what does that mean? I mean, where are we? Are we moving the puck forward? Are we losing ice relative to whatever? And of course, we were all too familiar with repeated announcements on the same things, and it was very confusing. We knew we had a problem. We knew we weren't investing enough. I come out of the residential construction sector, and you need infrastructure to build housing on. We knew we had problems there. We could see it. We could feel it. And so we thought, well, we need to understand this better. We need to understand, if we're going to be promoting and doing research on infrastructure, what's our goal? Where do we need to go? And so that's when we first, well, it wasn't actually the first time we came into contact with Paul and Can't Say It, but that's where that first report was done on the 5%. And so I kind of had two questions sort of evolving and rolling out of that. One is the research, and I've never asked you this question, Paul, I don't know why, but the Peel report, which is great and scary at the same time, because if Peel was planning to do a lot of stuff based on some projections that, like, for example, on employment in particular, which is particularly important, if those projections are wrong, then I'm not going to ask you what's happening with Peel, but you might comment on that, but I'd be more curious as to, are other municipalities now, as a result of that, going to be sort of having a second look at what their projections are, where they see things going? So that was my first question. And the second question is, just curious, with the panelists, not to put you on the spot or anything, because I know you represent certain organizations, but where do you see this modeling now being applied? Because one of the things that we realized, of course, that we know good decisions are based on good information, and there seemed to be a huge information deficit in some of these considerations, not necessarily at the micro level, but at the sort of provincial economic level. So those two things. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll deal with the first question. The infrastructure deficit, some really big numbers get thrown around. No one really knows what the deficit is. But by using experiments and computer simulations, we can get a sense of its effect. So to answer your first question in the first report, is the infrastructure deficit, the absence of stock within Ontario, cost the GDP about 0.6%, right, over the last 20 years. Now, when you talk 120 billion, 140 billion as a deficit, you're cognitively numb to those numbers. And as you know, because we did the study, we're interested in human behaviour. We like to model agents. So we wanted to make that number more real. And what that means is because of the underinvestment in infrastructure, and if it continues to go within Ontario, it costs a 20-year-old entering the labour force, right, over $400,000 over their lifetime in lost real wages. If you net present value that, that's like asking them to give you $60,000 on the very first day of their job. So the infrastructure deficit has the effect of actually borrowing from the generations that follow us. So that's one part of your answer, response back to your answer. The region appeal, when we did the region appeal simulation and the study, down to every single household and business in Peel. And we looked at the cost, the risks, and the rewards of growth. One of the biggest things I feel that Region Appeal got from that, and they've now got a Rubik's Cube on every desk in the government of Peel, because of the systems concept that you cannot look at one side of the cube and solve one side at a time. Because if you've got all your best minds in the room working on their individual sides, you've got a solution, but they're across 6 different cubes. This is a non-linear problem in which you've got to plan and orchestrate, and sometimes green side on a cube could be transportation. And transportation might be able to figure out their side of the cube in 4 steps, but they messed up white and blue and red and so on. So then by using simulation, you can actually get a sense that transportation might have to take 2 or 3 extra steps so that white, blue and red are whole. Right? So Peel, I feel, recognised that most of the risks of municipal planning in Peel is actually done, most of the risks are sourced outside Peel. What their environment can do to them. So while they were very focused in terms of planning within Peel, what the study had sort of represented to them is what's going on with their neighbours. What's going on in the city, what's going on in Hamilton, and what's going on around them, what's going on globally, because a bulk of their risks are actually outside Peel. So I'm hoping that the emphasis of municipalities is to actually pick up on, it's not just about, putting something in and understanding the rewards, but it's also infrastructure can act as an insurance policy and a risk management activity as well. I'll leave it for the other panel members to jump in.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay.
And your second question?
Always have.
Well,
modeling.
I'm curious to know where I guess part of the first question was, are other regions looking at their employment numbers now?
I do appreciate that it's a concern. I do appreciate that on the ground, when they look at places to grow projections and they actually see what's happening on the ground, that there is a disconnect. I think that there is an effort there. When we did Peel, every forecast coming out of Peel across their 45 different departments are coming out of one model. And we were able to show that water and wastewater investment is actually connected to unemployment rates, which is connected to their social housing expenses and social policies. So our other municipalities, we're having conversations.
So the second part of my question was, how do you, if any of you can comment on this, how do you see this modeling being utilized going forward? And one thing that comes to my mind, though, if the government announced $130 billion over 10 years, well, you're not going to spend all that in the first year. So how do you, and to Paul's point about making, and I think as well, making the right choices, how can this, do you see this modeling being useful and adding to maybe somewhat of a prioritization of the decisions that are going to be made? In other words, which projects do you go with first where you get the biggest bang for the economic buck? Because it seems to me, I might be wrong, but we're approaching, we've got a long way towards being able to measure the relative merits of infrastructure investments.
Okay, so I'll quickly answer that question, and maybe some of the panel members could jump off the back of my quick response on that. The model is just a tool. It's giving you a sense of roughly right rather than getting it exactly wrong. It takes a village to come together, and one of those, it's just a cog in a decision-making planning process. It's about sustainability. Even when you've got a project that's 10, 15 years, nature's taught us there's really no thing as a straight line. There's something that can always come up, and the model is really good at identifying the risk to the success of the productivity of that particular investment. Other than that, I think models can get overused. That's seductive and dangerous. Equally applies to any model. Being a modeler, we know this. So it's basically there's a symbiotic relationship. A computer plus a human is always going to be better than a computer on its own or a human on its own. And this is really just to give you a view of what can actually destroy value and what can create value. But then it's over to the experts.
And speaking of experts, over to the mayor.
No, I'm a politician, remember?
Okay.
If I could try a metaphor, on the earlier, one of Paul's slides, he showed this sort of optimal area. I know you don't like optimal point, but I think your slide said optimal area, and that's what we're all shooting for. And one of the things I liked about the 3D representation of that as sort of a hill to be climbed on which all sides you can drop off is I feel that's a good metaphor for a systemic approach to investment to achieve overcome the productivity gap. So one of the things I like about Kansia's system-based modeling is to say, okay, there's the infrastructure investment, and that's a significant slope. That's one side of this hill. But there are other sides. There's a labor market. There's an employment situation. There is healthcare. There are individual realities, all of which can be in some ways shaped and affected by public policy. And it's a tremendous juggling act, isn't it? I mean, if we say we plow all available additional capital into infrastructure investment, what are we letting drop on the other side of the hill? And are we actually any higher up in elevation? Or have we just tumbled down the other side or slipped around the other side? That's the very difficult juggling act. And a very quick example, I've got an affordable housing crisis. Average home prices in the city of Barrie have increased by 10 to 15% for 4 straight years. We now have the 3rd highest rent in Ontario after Toronto and Ottawa. Nobody believes me, but go look it up. CMHC will tell you that. That is mostly a supply side problem. Our construction of affordable rental housing, and any notion of affordable, has been zero. And the demand is driven by population growth, by demographics, and many other things. That is causing inefficiencies in our local economy. If I want to put my economist's hat on, I talk about it in different ways when I'm at the city council table or out in the community. But if we let that drop, I can put all the money into roads and proper infrastructure investment I want. People are going to struggle so badly on the housing side that they are not going to be any further ahead in terms of either their spending behavior, their overall utility, or most importantly, their quality of life and their sense of success. So that's where I think the model has a huge contribution to add. It's a difficult thing to make politicians think systemically about anything because we're faced with decisions that have raw political consequences that are right in front of us, and they're usually singular in their topic areas. But if we can find a way to convey the importance of that, I think the model has a huge contribution to make, and the mode of thinking has a huge contribution to make.
Mark?
I would agree with that. I think the value of the model, first and foremost, is that it makes it clear that if you do the right thing for the right reasons, you will get fairly dramatic results. So I think that part is invaluable in encouraging smart decision-making at the front end. I'm not there yet in terms of my faith that those who are in the decision-making role will make the right decisions for the right reasons. So it can help, but it can't force the right behavior at the front end. That's a whole different equation, and I think the mayor got to a little bit of that too. And if you can master that front end piece, you've got something that's pretty powerful.
I want to push on this a little bit because we had a question earlier in the morning about we're going to be building all of this transit. How do we make sure we get the ridership or the density of population to really get the ROI that we're looking for? And this really comes down to government coordination. We work very closely with Metrolinx, and if you think of Metrolinx RER project, it's not just Metrolinx, it's 9 different municipalities that have to be coordinated with and collaborated with to deliver that project, so you've got last mile connectivity throughout. So some of the developers have said if we could get the municipalities that are adjacent to where RER is taking place to create the zoning so we could start building multi-purpose housing or high-density housing, that's a way of solving for, but it also calls on a level of coordination that historically we haven't had to consider. So Mark, I'm going to throw that very easy question to you. In your opinion, what can we be doing to solve this, to get kind of both municipal needs as well as kind of the density and housing needs adjacent to these investments?
You're asking me to redefine behavioral theory.
You're good. You're the man for the job. There you go.
I think that on infrastructure development generally, there is without a doubt a demand that all parties come to the table and really think this through in a way that is going to be collaborative and therefore by definition hopefully give you a better result. It's I've always said it's easier to talk to myself than to talk to my wife, because once two of us are in the equation, it changes completely. I think it'll be very interesting. This is maybe not an answer for you, but I think it'll be very interesting to see how the federal government moves ahead now with its rollout of its infrastructure program, because clearly the early messaging is very much around a collaborative approach. So the federal government has said that for the programs they have in place now, whatever they may be thinking about in terms of their ambitious program going forward, it's going to be predicated on a collaborative approach with, first and foremost, provinces. But the Minister of Infrastructure has made it clear too that he believes that municipalities are better positioned to determine what their needs are than for the federal government to impose it on them. So clearly at the federal level, the dynamic or the ecosystem is going to be changing. And while it's a little early to figure out results, I think if people come to the table with the right kind of motivation, you have an opportunity there to really move an equation ahead in a way that will be much more significant nationally than it has been in the past.
Anyone else on the panel want to weigh in on that thought?
Well, the advice that we gave the federal government as Ontario's Big City Mayor's Caucus was that it would be a mistake and contrary to their stated goals and platform to again engage in selecting projects by building either an extensive program, an application program, or any kind of approval process that did anything other than select projects based on some kind of formula-based funding. If truly the government's aim is to stimulate the economy, then the easiest and best thing, in our opinion, is up the gas tax funding and allow municipalities to deploy that capital towards projects that are highest on our asset management plans. If the federal government wishes to create some strong accountability for that, even add some criteria that relate to ensuring economic benefit, I think that would be appropriate. But I really hope they resist the urge to build another stimulus type program. They have claimed that they will not be about partisan spending decisions, and they claim that this is about stimulus. And I hope that they will approach it in such a way that is aimed at those objectives rather than the ribbon cuttings, as was referred to earlier.
Well, if I can follow through on the theme of stimulus, I mean, we're increasingly becoming an urban nation, and with more people and jobs moving into large urban centers, should the stimulus therefore be primarily directed to those large urban centers that have the biggest need, the biggest demand?
Yes.
Good.
As you would expect from the mayor of a city. Although I'm a medium-sized city, and depending on whether you're reading the Star or the Globe, I'm either urban or I'm suburban, and you can pick which one. But I think one of the really interesting questions is, I mean, if I'm reading the research correctly that was presented earlier today, there is some suggestion that the benefit is disproportionate in urban areas. So if we're sort of triaging the problem of underinvestment and trying for bang for our buck, as if I'm the Ontario government, if I'm Minister Del Duca, I'm saying I'm going to get the greatest return on my investment probably in the city of Toronto, simply by virtue of the number of additional people I can move through that infrastructure. I think one dimension we haven't yet examined as a society, because it's only emerging, is what is actually the impact of the sharing economy going to be on things like transportation, on things like work patterns, on parking. I mean, there's an Uber out there for parking. I've forgotten what it's called. It basically allows you to find a parking space in the neighborhood that you're driving to that somebody is willing to put up for rent, and you pay the owner for their parking space in their driveway, and then you go away. I mean, that's fascinating technology. It's going to be a huge problem for municipalities. But you know, the impact of that kind of sharing economy on the efficiency of urban economies could offset some of that. Yeah. And I believe the potential for those efficiency increases is far, far greater in a fully urban environment than in a suburban or even a semi-urban environment. So that's another piece that I would want to see looked at, because I think we're on the cusp of some of those things starting to have a noticeable economic impact.
Thank you. Mark?
One community I think needs a little bit of attention is not on the urban front, but rather Aboriginal communities. So we all know that across Canada there are huge infrastructure challenges that Aboriginal communities are facing, whether it's around housing or water, wastewater, or schools. And as you may know, at our recent conference, we were fortunate to have Chief Louis from the Soyuz Band on a panel, and his comment was, because we were talking about investing in new infrastructure, and he was saying, you know, the reality is for us is we don't have any roads at all. So thinking about trying to upgrade existing infrastructure is moot for the Aboriginal community. So irrespective of where we go with respect to municipal or provincial infrastructure investments, I think that it's really critical for us, too, that we address the real challenges being faced by Aboriginal communities around Canada.
No. Point taken. Paul?
Just a quick comment. I wish that infrastructure was simpler, in that you get a bigger bang for your dollar in a sort of a city and what have you. The answer is that's not the case. It's very unique in terms of what the needs are of the particular community, or it could be a manufacturing centre with very few residents, which demands a different infrastructure response. We have looked at small communities, and sometimes it only takes $10 million in order to be able to get a multiplier of $90 to $100 million from that. And the key point is saying that to ministers. You gotta help me with that. And the point being is that it's got to be on a needs basis, and it's interlinked in terms of what is ultimately needed. So the model doesn't presuppose that where there's a bigger population centre that's where you put your money. It's very nuanced, and it's got a lot to do with the job base there, the private capital base there, the population, and a whole bunch of different aspects. And that's why you ultimately have to simulate everything together in order to begin to appreciate the non-linear unintended consequences of poking the system.
Okay. Any last questions from the floor before I turn it over for concluding remarks? Yes, thank you.
Yes. Ernie Lynch from Lynch Group of Companies in Mississauga, and Paul's question is directed to you, and I'm familiar with your work, and I think the approach of an economic impact assessment is way deeper than an environmental impact assessment, and we've discussed that before. The 3D solid model that you showed, I'd just like an explanation as to why the provincial dollars sort of took you a little further along the mountain, but federal dollars got you a better class lift ticket to the summit. Why is that?
Okay, because money's going out of the system. If there's, let me explain it this way, is that if you've got a room full of people and you've got an activity that's producing something, and there's someone in the room that is taking money off the others that are producing something, there comes a point where they're taking too much off that productive activity, and you start to deteriorate the actual health of the very activity that you're benefiting from. So the point with the federal government is it's money that leaves the province. We're getting a much bigger bang for our buck if some of the money actually comes back, rather than finding the money internally within the province. So within this simulation, we have conservation of value, which basically means that when you invest in infrastructure, you need to tell the system where you're going to get that from, what policy, because it's internally consistent and it's conservation of value. So the fact is that when you look at Ontario and money leaves Ontario, it's not a big stretch for us to intuitively understand that we can get a bigger bang of the buck if we pull that back in, as opposed to sourcing even more money internally in the province.
Okay. I'm going to turn things over now to the panelists. I'm going to ask each of them for 2 minutes of closing remarks. The theme today, and it's been an excellent, excellent forum. Thank you so much, Andy, for including us. It's looking at the economic returns of public infrastructure investment. And we've had a really good presentation of the case for action. What I'd like to ask each of the panelists now to sum up in 2 minutes is what is a key action priority that we should be taking away from this? And this could be directed at government or it could be directed at business. Paul, let's start with you.
My remark would be is that an incredible amount of money will be invested over the next 10 years in infrastructure, and because of the systemic benefits that have been identified, and those systemic benefits can be negative, positive or neutral, it's really important for us to get the coordination across governments. It's really important for the experts that when they posit a certain infrastructure plan, that over time that is not politically hijacked. And I believe that evaluation and having someone in the room that is measuring the consequences of particular decisions and directions that we're going in has to be a beneficial thing, because at least then we know what are the trade-offs costing us. At least we know that if a project stopped and start and stopped and start, we have a sense of what that might be costing us.
Thank you. Mark?
Just picking up on Paul's point, I think the importance of putting in place a vehicle to enable the dialogue between all the parties who engage in this kind of activity, whether the federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, Aboriginal communities, they need a forum where they can come together to talk about these issues. I think the kinds of things that you're doing at the Toronto Board of Trade is great. We're happy to work with you as a council. I think Mayor Lehman's initiative with other mayors across Ontario is exceptional, and we're keen to work with him as well in order to enable that dialogue to take place. And obviously in the end, because there is a need for infrastructure, we can debate how much the deficit is. It doesn't really matter. We know there's a need, and there are a number of different ways you can do it, and you would expect that our organization would be a promoter of the AFP approach or P3 approach, recognizing it's not a panacea, because when it's right, it's really demonstrated great results. And when not, we would encourage people to look at other options. The only specific action I would suggest, and it's completely unrelated to anything we've talked about today, it's simple. My view is that every time we dig, irrespective of what model is driving that activity, we should be making provision to lay fiber right now, so that in fact we can bring our communities up to not just 1 gig, but 5 gig or more, so that we can clearly connect remote communities, but more importantly, we can put in place the infrastructure that will attract the talent to our cities around the country. So it's rather simple, but important.
I agree.
Yeah, so it's interesting from listening to all this today that we're just one part of a bigger picture at Infrastructure Ontario that's taking place here. But the important thing is, even though we're one part, it's important that we do our part well in this. And one of the things that's been important for governments in the past is that they get excited about making these big infrastructure investments, and if you don't make them properly and the project goes late and over budget, what should be a good news story turns into a bad news story. When you have that, governments are less inclined to invest infrastructure in infrastructure in the future, which is bad for all of us. So we're trying to do our bit to solve that. One of the things that we've done in particular is we've started publishing our data about our track record in terms of on time and on budget delivery. We have now published our third track record. It was done by a cost consulting firm, Hanscom. We've done one the year before by Altus, another big cost consulting firm. Our track record was that of our first 45 projects, 44 and 98% of them were on budget. Approximately 73% of them were on time. We're not as good at on time as we are at on budget, but it's still, you know, the one thing we're still struggling with is getting data on traditional project delivery because other people don't seem to want to release their data. But that's not the story that the public is used to hearing in terms of projects being successful. So if we can continue to do that, if we continue to generate those kind of results, then we'll continue to get more investment in infrastructure. We're already seeing at the federal level, we've got a commitment to invest more in infrastructure and transit and in social housing is what we're hearing. You know, I've listened to Mayor Tory, the C2P3 conference. He's totally aligned. He's willing to do his bit. And the more we can do to generate that kind of data and those kind of results, then the more we're going to have money invested in infrastructure and the better it will be for everybody. And that'll be our contribution to the debate.
Perfect, thank you. Mayor?
So the one priority I would suggest is give, on behalf of my people, politicians, give us the tools we need to make good decisions. And those tools are not merely the studies, the track record, the experience that informs good decision making. It needs to be translated into political currency by being translated into kitchen table economics. The reality is we have decision makers who are not very well versed in many of the subjects that we're talking about. To be frank, it's an enormous task to try and get people to speak up for good policy. It shouldn't be. All of you in this room are very capable of doing it. Many others out there in our communities are, but I'll give you a very quick example of why I think this needs to be the top priority. My city, along with 5 others in Ontario, is involved in a mega merger in the electricity sector. PowerStream, EnerSource, and Horizon are creating a much larger municipally owned local distribution company. That merger has substantial synergy savings. It will return more money to the municipal shareholders, and it will allow us to offset price increases, or at least deliver lower increases in the distribution portion of people's electricity bills. That is a case which chambers of commerce and boards of trade should have been all over in helping us make to our councils. And yet those voices, either because we didn't get them that information or they didn't seek it out, those voices were not heard. Now, all of the cities ultimately approved the deal. So in my opinion, the right thing has happened in this case. A more efficient model of delivering electricity for us is being created. But I'll tell you this very last story. When we created our asset management plan in the city of Barrie, we sent a van around the entire city equipped with sonar. The sonar was to assess the condition of the road base. So the pavement, you can visually inspect. The road base, you need sonar to detect what kind of condition it's in. When we did that, one of our local TV networks, who shall remain nameless, instead of calling CanSIA or the Council on Public-Private Partnerships or the Board of Trade or any other knowledgeable organization to assess whether that was a good idea, that the city was spending $65,000 is what it cost us for the consultant with the van. Instead of calling any of those organizations, they talked to a taxi driver who said, I drive on these roads every day. I could have told them which ones were bumpy and it wouldn't have cost 65 grand. Now, if you're sitting at home, you're a resident of Barrie and you're sitting at home and you see that story on the TV, do you think your government's doing a good job or a poor job? And the problem there is that the network didn't go to a knowledgeable source. Or if they did, they should have gone to the cab driver and then another source at least. I raise that issue because I need you, I need the people who do the modeling. I need the organizations who are involved in construction of infrastructure, in evaluating economic benefits of that investment, to convey those benefits. Because it is shocking how few occasions we have received that message as local politicians, and how often we have to try and create that message ourselves. So give us the tools to make better decisions. We will not always make better decisions, but you will get more decisions that reflect outcomes. And ultimately, that can only be to the benefit of the province and our communities.
And I think just to carry on with that, in terms of political currency, it's going to be a lot of pain. The next 10 years are going to give us a tremendous amount of infrastructure development and building underway. And the thing that I would encourage organizations like yours, our organizations working on this as well, is to offset that pain, is to really focus in on that job creation opportunity. So there's a lot we need to do from engineering firms to those in the construction business to start thinking about career days and other ways of starting to deal with the talent gap that's going to be emerging, and how do we leverage our youth into these employment opportunities? How do we get them on the right career paths? Because there's jobs there at the end of their studies. So that would be, if I were to take an actual priority, that's really good currency, I think, for a mayor to be able to take back and say, and if we do this, these are the jobs that are being created, and it's these kids in these colleges that are going to be prime candidates for them. So I want to thank, very great panel, excellent event today. Congratulations, Andy, and to the entire organization and to CanSIA.